Hello, everybody, and welcome back for part 2 of our series on sex and gender differences in sports-related concussions. Here today again with you is myself, Carrie Esipenko, and with me is Dr. Abby Bretson. So in part 1 of our series, we talked about sex and gender differences in rates and outcomes after concussion. And in this follow-up talk, we're going to talk about maybe why there are differences in sports-related concussions for males and females. But first, we need to talk about what's sex and gender. So sex refers to the biological determination based on chromosomes, hormones, and anatomical attributes. So this includes things like biological mechanisms that increase the risk of concussion, or gonadal or sex hormones that are associated with increased risk or protracted recovery patterns after injury. Gender refers to the behavior and identity expressed with regard to a set of social, cultural, and environmental norms. So this is things like differences in reporting behaviors after injury, or differences in rules or access to sports medicine personnel. So when we look at biological sex-based mechanisms that increase the risk and impact recovery from concussion, things that have been identified in the literature so far are neck strength, differences in axons in the brain, as well as gonadal or sex hormones. So it has been hypothesized that the magnitude of force that is transferred to the head is mitigated by neck strength. And greater neck strength appears to reduce the risk and severity of sports-related concussion by limiting how quickly and how much the head moves when it's impacted. In general, due to biology, females tend to have lower neck strength than males. And there's been studies looking at differences in strength within our athletes. And this study by Dr. Bretson found that there were sex differences in how strong males and females' necks were when tested in different positions. There's also been studies looking at whether neck strength is actually associated with concussion risk. And what these studies have found is that there's the odds of sustaining a concussion decrease by 5% for every 1 pound increase in neck strength. So if you increase your neck strength by 1 pound, you reduce that risk of concussion by 5%. However, when they looked at this by male and female athletes, they found that this association was only significant in male athletes and that it wasn't quite significant in female athletes. But there is some data to suggest that neck strength can help reduce the risk of concussion. There's also been studies that have been mostly done in cellular or in stem cells. And what they've found is that there are sex differences in axons, or the fibers in the brain, that may be one reason why females show longer recovery and more symptoms after concussion. So for example, these cellular studies have shown that there's evidence that males have larger and a greater number of axons compared to females, and that there's more injured axons in females compared to males after a concussion or a TBI or traumatic brain injury. And that after the injury, there are less axons that are able to transmit signals in females compared to males. Now, there's also evidence of that different gonadal or sex hormones may affect sports-related concussion. So we're just going to give a really high overview of 4 different types of hormones that have been associated with outcomes in female athletes. So first, there's gonadotropins. So this includes the follicle-stimulating hormone, which produces or promotes growth of follicles in the ovary. There's also the luteinizing hormone, which induces ovulation or the release of an egg. And after ovulation, FSH and LH return to baseline and are involved in the production of steroid hormones. Steroid hormones include estrogen, which has a role in ovulation and thickening the lining of the uterus, as well as progesterone, which prepares the uterus for pregnancy. And these hormones cycle throughout a woman's or a female's menstrual cycle. And so you can see here that on the top and bottom, there's the representation of FSH and LH, as well as estrogen and progesterone, and that across the cycle, these hormones fluctuate. So what some research has shown is that where in the menstrual cycle phase a female gets a concussion or a traumatic brain injury impacts outcomes. And so these studies have shown that when women experience a concussion in the luteal phase, where progesterone is high, they experience worse outcomes or worse quality of life up to 1 month after injury. And so what we think is happening here is that when you get hit and you're in the luteal phase, it actually causes progesterone to decline and causes a withdrawal effect, which results in more symptoms.
And so now moving on to some other potential sex and gender differences is something we think about as access to care. And so when we think about access to care, this might be more reflective of our gender specific differences. However, there also are some reasons that this is associated with also being male versus female. And so access to care, what we find is that males and females do not typically have the same access to care, and that this access then influences recovery outcomes. So during athletic events, what research shows is that males more often are prioritized in their access to athletic trainers and sports medicine professionals. So these sports medicine professionals are more present at male athletic events and male competitive events versus female athletic events or even female practice events. Also, we also see differences in access to care relative to clinic visits. So we see differences in where males and females go to obtain follow-up care, and that females often have longer time to be seen at specialty care clinics versus males. And so when we think about where these athletes are receiving care after their injury happens, this can influence recovery outcomes, which may predispose females to then have those longer or more protracted recoveries. Other things that we think about relative to sex and gender differences as potential explanations to why females have differences in concussion risk and outcomes or recovery are things like rules, style of play in sport, and also reporting behaviors between males and females. Specifically thinking about rules, in some sports like ice hockey and lacrosse, males and females have different rules and also different governance on the type of equipment that they have in their sport. And so this might be predisposing as to why there's differences in concussion incidence or risk between those sports if they're playing the sport differently. However, in sports that have the same rules and equipment, and one example is soccer, males and females have different causes of concussion. So this makes us think that there's differences in style of play between males and females that lead to different concussion risk and outcomes. For example, we found in a study of soccer athletes that males most often had contact with another person to cause their injury, where females more often had contact with a ball to cause their injury. And so if we can start to understand how and why these concussions are happening, we can start to figure out how and why females and males have differences in concussion risk and outcomes. And another last example are differences seen in reporting behaviors between males and females. What we find is that females are more likely to disclose their suspected concussions, they report more of symptoms, and they also report different symptom types than males. So this is reporting behaviors is an important thing to consider when we think about differences in the number of concussions, in the rate of concussions, and the outcomes of these concussions that are occurring. And overall, what we've described throughout these two talks and really focused in on male and female differences. We found females have higher rates of concussions and often display longer recovery outcomes in different ways that recovery is measured. And also we went into describing why we do, or potential reasons as to why we see differences between males and females, and differentiate those between potential sex and gender differences. So thank you for attending our talk, and hopefully you were able to learn something.
Thank you, everyone.